It's my very great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Glenn Patterson. Glenn is the author of 3 works of non-fiction and 10 novels, most recently his 2016 novel, Gull. He is also the co-writer of Good Vibrations with Colin Carberry for BBC Films, which the pair adapted for stage at the Lyric Theatre, Belfast. In 2012, The Mill for Grinding Old People Young was the choice for Belfast One City, One Book. And I think that tells you something about his place in the culture of this city and the power of his voice of and for Belfast. He has written plays for Radio 3 and Radio 4, and with composer Neil Martin, Glenn Patterson wrote, long story short, the Belfast Opera in 2016. He is now the director of the Seamus Heaney Centre at Queen's University Belfast, and I hope you'll give a very warm welcome to Glenn Patterson.
Shit, arriving at the podium after the applause has ended. I should have got up there faster. So we got the only problem with glasses is with these I can see that, but I can't see you. So I'm going to keep them on if that's all right, you lovely blurry people. It's always a pleasure to be here in the Waterfront Hall, which was our first major post-ceasefire building on which it seemed we expended all the glass we had been storing up throughout the 1970s and the 1980s, when all we built were bomb-proof shelters. I say it's always a pleasure to be here. I am just a tiny bit disappointed that I'm not doing this in the Ulster Museum, which is home to my favourite sign in all of Belfast. Men's toilets, and then just below that, window on the world. Paddy Gilmore tells me that I am the last act of this particular Museum Association conference before the torch is handed over to Brighton. Ladies and gentlemen, please accept my apologies. I'm as close as you're going to get to Jimmy Page. If you imagine me delivering this not from a podium, but like Jimmy in Beijing from the top of a bus, or rather a glider, one of our new bendy purple buses, of which, in case you hadn't noticed, we are greatly proud. I'd be amazed if you'd been here for 2 days and not had someone tell you that you really, really ought to try them. I'd be even more amazed if you'd been here for even half that time and not had someone, many ones, tell you about Belfast's proud history of democracy and dissent. You could probably by now recite to me the story of how half a dozen young men in the last decade of the 18th century met on Cave Hill, overlooking the city, or the town as it was then, and swore an oath to unite all the people of Ireland, Catholic, Protestant, that is to say, established church Protestant, and dissenter, which for Ireland then and for Belfast in particular was synonymous with Presbyterian. Religious and political dissent were, if not everywhere, intertwined, far from strange bedfellows then in this northeast corner of the island. The vow on Cave Hill is in more ways than one the pinnacle of our political history to date, the clearest, most succinct expression of a non-sectarian politics which still eludes us, and the pursuit of which in the late 1790s, for every peak here, alas, a trough, ended in bloodshed and the very sectarian strife its architects tried to transcend. They did, though, succeed in leaving their stamp on the city in other ways. The Belfast Society for Promoting Knowledge, more commonly known as the Lennon Hall Library, still flourishing 230 years after its foundation, is a product of that radical moment. Several of its founding members died in or were executed after the United Irish Rebellion of 1798. And though it's commonplace to say that the repression of that rebellion and the Act of Union that quickly followed focused the attention of dissenters thereafter on matters more spiritual than temporal, some of the openness to new ideas that characterised the previous generation is evident in the founding of Belfast's first museum in 1831. The guiding lights were again, in the main, young Presbyterian men. But if any one individual represents the continuation of the spirit and ideals of the late 18th century into the 19th, it is Mary Ann McCracken, sister of Henry Joy McCracken, the Belfast United Irish leader, hanged outside the market house on the corner of High Street and Corn Market, where Dunn's Stores is today. The entrance of Dunn's Stores is even at the same slight diagonal to the street as the market house door was. Mary Ann McCracken turned 28 the week before her brother's execution. His body was handed over at the foot of the scaffold into her care. She survived him by almost 70 years, well into the era of photography. I've just kicked my water over. All over the electrics is what I'm saying. This could be, if this was the movie, there'd be like a little flame moving across at this stage. And defiantly, I'd still be talking. Usually the way it goes is the highest paid person is the one who's going to survive if anything happens, so I'm running straight away. Mary Ann McCracken was, and I'm thirsty as well, that's the other thing. I had left it thinking that was like the cleverest place to leave it. I also knocked one over beside my bed this morning. That's just... In fact, I got to tell you this, the first words I said this morning when I got up was, "You dick," to myself. So often do I say them. In fact, this is true. My wife told me that I woke up in the middle of the night once and just said, "You dick," to myself. So whatever it was going on. Mary Ann McCracken, do you remember her? I should just stop. Just saw the screen that said Glenn Patterson, writer. So, back to that. Mary Ann McCracken was, in her very long lifetime, a campaigner against the causes and the effects of poverty, at one point lobbying the Board of the Poor House for candles sufficient unto the hours of darkness for the children who until then had been allowed the equivalent of only 1 hour a day, or rather night, even in the depths of winter. She took a keen interest in prison reform, care of the sick, and even, apparently, animal welfare. Her admiration for the nuns in Belfast's first convent being tempered only by her certainty that she could never keep to a vow of silence herself if, when out and about, she was unable to take the part of some poor, ill-used animal. A disapprover of strong drink and coarse language, she was also a lifelong opponent of slavery. She and her friends abstained from sugar while the slave trade was ongoing in the West Indies. Even after abolition throughout the British Empire, she continued, one of only 16 or 17 people in Belfast, all women by her reckoning, to protest against, I guess that means 16 or 7 people by her reckoning, all women, rather than all women by her reckoning. I'm reading that as though I wrote that. I should just... One of only 16, 7. There were only 16 or 17 people, by her reckoning, all women, who were still protesting against the perpetuation of slavery elsewhere. To the image of half a dozen young men taking a vow on Cave Hill, I add, as the epitome of dissent Belfast style, Mary Ann McCracken, aged 89, standing at Belfast docks, handing anti-slavery leaflets to emigrants boarding the ships that would take them to the United States. A decenter skin, as my father would have said, may never have walked the streets of Belfast. And I would be the world's worst liar if I said that hers was the version of dissent that I aspired to or even paid attention to when I was growing up. When I was growing up, though, dissent was something you got sent off the football field for. Sent off for dissent. Sent off for dissent. It's a perfect little capsule of a phrase that seems to flirt with palindrome, sent off for, and then, do you know what, it just can't be bothered with that symmetry shit. I don't know whether you could call golden an age whose principal element appeared to be mud, but the 1970s seemed to specialize in players who combined sublime individual skill with long hair, untucked shirts, and constant mouthing off. Charlie George, Peter Marinello, Stanley Bowles, and the daddy of them all, of course, Belfast's own George Best. Now, before I say another word about George Best and discipline, I ought to mention that shortly after the turn of the millennium, do you remember when that was a thing, the turn of the millennium? Do you remember it was a really, really big thing? We all talked about the turn of the millennium. Shortly after 2001, I think they just now call it just after the turn of the millennium. In 2001, Double Band Films here in Belfast made a documentary called George Best's Body, which featured a full-length portrait of Best in his footballing prime, wearing just a pair of shorts. The term kicked to pieces might have been coined for his legs. On the football pitch, at least, he was a man far more sinned against than sinning, but he was also, for a time, one of the most famous players on the planet. So when he sinned. On April the 18th, 1970, Northern Ireland played Scotland at Belfast's Windsor Park. I was 8 years old, too young to go. It would be another year before I saw my first international, but my two elder brothers went with my dad. I remember running to them as they came in the back door. I only had two questions. How did we do? We lost. And how did Georgie play? My dad shook his head in disgust and despair. Georgie had been sent off for flinging mud at referee Eric Jennings, who, as if the offence needed to be made any starker, had been wearing a white shirt for the day. To distinguish him in that black and white television world most of us still lived in, from the dark shirts of Northern Ireland and even darker shirts of Scotland. Luckily, in those days, being sent off was no bar to playing in the next game, which George did 3 days later against England, and scored. We lost again, but he scored, so, you know, small victories. I say Best was the daddy of them all, but my favourite image of that era is of a player, some of you might know him, called Robin Friday, playing for Cardiff City. Wheeling away from the goalkeeper, Milja Aleksic, he is left sitting in the mud after scoring a goal against Luton Town in the old second division. Now, I like football, but in the ordinary run of things, I don't, and certainly in the ordinary pre-internet run of things living in Belfast, I didn't regularly encounter photographs of English second division matches. I only know this image because it was used on the cover of a 1996 Super Furry Animals CD single, The Man Don't Give a Fuck, which takes its title from the second line of a couplet from Steely Dan's Showbiz Kids. Showbiz Kids making movies of themselves, you know, they don't give a fuck about anybody else. Not only takes its title from, but samples and repeats that line 50 times in the course of its 4 minutes, 47 seconds, making it, for a time, the sweariest record ever released. It's no longer the world's sweariest. That record is now held by a live version of the same song, recorded in 2004, which comes in at 23 and a half minutes and therefore contains a fuckload more fucks. On the sleeve of the studio version, the goalkeeper has been cropped out of the photograph so that all you're left with is Robin Friday looking in truth like he doesn't give much of a fuck about anything. Although Robin Friday himself isn't the man referred to in the song's title. The man of the title is the counterculture man, or in the words of Super Furry Animals lead singer and lyricist Griff Rhys, any organization that is terrorizing you, or anyone who's cramping your style. Or as my colleague at the Seamus Heaney Centre, the poet Leontia Flynn says, she always thinks when she hears a mysterious they being invoked, the people in capes. And Robin Friday is giving them, as in fact, in that far-off day against Luton Town, he gave Milia Alexic the fingers. Earlier this summer, my screenwriting partner and I, this summer? This is this summer? Earlier this autumn. I just completely misread. This is wishful thinking on a rainy day in Belfast. Earlier this autumn, my screenwriting partner and I, Colin Carberry, adapted our 2012 film Good Vibrations for stage at the Lyric Theatre here in Belfast. Good Vibrations is the story of Terry Hooley, whose father had repeatedly stood for election, unsuccessfully, on a non-sectarian Labour ticket, and who at the age of 29 in the late 1970s, that's Terry was 29, not his dad, in the late 1970s opened a record shop on what was then the most bombed half-mile in all of Europe. A record shop that became a haven for a generation of young people from all quarters of the city, and in time spawned a record label that released the Undertones' Teenage Kicks. There are a great many stories about Terry Hooley, most of which he has told himself. But just to give you a flavour of the man, here's a story I heard from someone else at an evening celebrating the history of protest song at the Oh Yes Centre on Gordon Street. A couple of years before the start of our troubles, so sometime in the mid-1960s, there was a demonstration. The guy I was talking to thought probably against the Vietnam War, down Royal Avenue, our main shopping street. Just as it was setting off, this guy looked over his shoulder and he saw Terry and his placard heading in the opposite direction on his own. "Terry," he shouted, "where are you going?" And Terry shouted back, "I'm forming a splinter group." Which is funny, well, I thought was funny. And typical Terry, but the real point of the story for me was what the man said to me next. He said, "Do you know what? We would all have done better to follow him." Many of the people in Terry's circle back then ended up drawn into the conflict, taking sides, taking up guns. He himself escaped an attempt on his life by people he knew, and he was severely beaten on more than one occasion for his refusal to take sides himself. The rest of the time, he was, as is often the lot of nonconformists and dissenters, dismissed as a joke, a clown. There's a key scene in our Good Vibrations just after the shop has opened, in which the crowd at a punk gig on which Terry has just stumbled chased the police. Actually, Brian Young was playing that gig. Brian, who was here earlier on, was playing at it. He may have mentioned it. Terry's just stumbled on this crowd, and they chased the police from the Pound Bar, which is about 200 yards from where we gathered this afternoon, chased them out with chants and jeers. I noticed in rehearsals for the stage production that the young cast all held up their middle fingers to wave goodbye to the cops. I had to point out to them that this was the 1970s. A single finger in Belfast was as exotic as an aubergine. It was two fingers, always two fingers. Stiff Little Fingers, one of the more overtly political Belfast bands at the time who recorded the seminal alternative Ulster, even incorporated a stylized version of the fingers in their logo. You could probably find it on display in the permanent exhibition of music from Northern Ireland down at Oh Yeah, or possibly even up in the Troubles and Beyond room at the Ulster Museum. Although, if you ask me, the logo is, well, a little too stiff, because you didn't just raise your fingers, you threw them. Bend it, stretch it, double it, send it. You wouldn't have thought it from the way I did it, but there's such energy in that. Energy mixed with insouciance, even glee. TV news cameras in those days, and in those days there were TV news cameras aplenty in Northern Ireland, were two-finger magnets. Teenage girls and boys would jostle to register their disdain. Was it disdain? Their disdain for whoever was on the other side of the screen looking back at them. And also to an extent, their disdain for the events that had brought the cameras there in the first place. I would call it a non-verbal form of dissent, were it not for the fact that it was often accompanied by 3 single-syllable words, equally gleefully delivered: up your hole. So, not non-verbal, but not necessarily structured either. At its most elemental, dissent is about differing in opinion, or even just in sentiment, feeling. We each of us at every stage of our lives define ourselves as much by what we dissent from as what we adhere to. My daughter told me the other day a friend of hers didn't have a record player. Now, 3 or 4 years ago, few people had, but it wasn't that her friend hadn't caught up. She had gone beyond. She's all about cassettes, my daughter said. Vinyl has become mainstream again, even a little smug. I'm speaking at a vinyl festival in Dunleary outside Dublin next weekend. I could be pleasantly surprised by the demographic. I am the demographic. The simple truth is that dissent can very easily harden into orthodoxy, that self-definition can quickly become self-regard. I think the measure of us all as people is how we behave towards those who dissent from us. Be tenacious by all means in your own dissent, but be dignified in the face of those who dissent from your beliefs. Which sort of brings me, there was no alphabetical way on earth we were going to get from Belfast to Brighton without encountering it, to Brexit. Ooh, that's a big groan. Ooh, ooh. Again, probably several. I see some leaflets down there mentioning Brexit, bridge to Brexit. I just wanted to say I voted to remain, not because I understand the European Union and all its workings fully, but because I feel the European project is in the best interests of the greatest number. I have to accept, though, that some people feel differently, or at least they did the last time they were asked. Quite a lot of people, actually. That is their right to feel differently. There are obviously twerps and zealots and not-so-closet xenophobes in their camp, heading it up, in fact. But there are also those who I can see felt themselves to be in a minority and wanted to register their dissent, only to find, perhaps to their surprise, that they were, after all, a majority. Those who had been the majority, meanwhile, found, to their horror, that they were now a minority, though not in Northern Ireland, where the majority voted for what turned out to be the minority cause, including a great many who'd grown up identified as a member of a different kind of majority within Northern Ireland itself, that is, though a minority on the island as a whole. If you follow me. If, in years to come, anyone asks me to describe the experience of these times, I will describe for them a real journey I took. I don't mean like as opposed to a made-up one, I mean by train, a real journey I once took from Manchester to Norwich, in which, on at least 2 separate occasions, the train pulled into a station facing in one direction and pulled out again facing the other. By the time it reached Thorpe Station in Norwich, my fellow passengers and I were so disoriented, the station guards were using cattle prods to steer us up the platform. Well, practically. Orthodoxy, as I had been saying before I hopped onto the train, generates dissent, becomes a new orthodoxy, generates new dissent. Dissent keeps us honest. Dissent reminds us we can go too far, not can, all too frequently do. Political opposition is, in this sense, dissent given institutional form. One of the things that has most irked me about the political dispensation in Northern Ireland in the wake of the Good Friday Agreement, which I also voted for 20 years ago in April just past. One of the things that has most irked me about it is that it made no provision for an official opposition. If citizens here hadn't known it already, the current inquiry into the Renewable Heating Initiative scandal, aka Cash for Ash, has revealed that our vaunted power-sharing executive is no more than a hollow shell of the long dreamt-of union of Catholic, Protestant, and dissenter. It has been, for most of its lifetime, a duopoly, a carve-up by two parties whose loathing for each other is only outweighed by their reluctance to relinquish control to anyone else. We did finally get a mechanism for an opposition in March 2016, although that has not yet come into effect, given that it requires a change to the standing orders of the Northern Ireland Assembly, which has itself not sat since the start of 2017. So still no opposition, and now, for the best part of 2 years, no fucking government. I was talking earlier about good vibrations. The film version of the story ends in the Ulster Hall, 24th of April, 1980. At the time, the largest venue in Belfast, for a gig that is supposed to be a fundraiser for the shop, which is in dire financial difficulties. Except Terry Hooley lets half the audience of punk kids in free. Because Belfast at that moment is in the midst of a particularly nasty spasm of violence. After a brief period in which it seemed as though things might be opening up, people are being dragged back behind their lines. Better to have this one glorious night, is Terry's reasoning, than to simply carry on until the next crisis. He rounds off the night at the microphone himself, singing a song, a hymn almost, to all those who, like himself, has been dismissed as jokes and clowns, reclaiming the terms. The song is Laugh at Me by Sonny Bono. So I don't care, laugh at me. If that's the fare I have to pay to be free, then baby, laugh at me. The play ends with the same song, but whereas in the film, Terry simply says he and the band are going to do an old Sonny Bono song because they fucking can, now he prefaces it by saying, they call us jokes, clowns, well fucking let them. And while he sings, by a feat of theatrical legerdemain, the scene changes and the audience is fast-forwarded with him from 1980 to 2018. Now, I can say this without blushing because it was not my doing or Colin Carberry's. It was entirely the director's, Des Kennedy's. But the audience were on their feet and cheering every single night the moment Laugh at Me finished, or the moment Aaron McCusker, who was playing Terry, finished with the song. On more than one occasion, they were on their feet long before that. I appreciate there might have been a very specific Northern Irish explanation for this reaction. For reasons just outlined, there was a huge amount of frustration with our disassembled state. But I think something more was going on, something more even than the general dissatisfaction with organised politics abroad in the world. Griff Rhys of the Super Furry Animals said at the time of its release, the man don't give a fuck could bring down the government right now, but in 5 years' time, we could be ruled by pilots from Venus, and then they'd be the man. Or here is an even more frightening thought. We ourselves, in time, become the man or woman, the establishment, the people in capes. As a human being, I am a mass of contradictions. I struggle for consistency, struggle to do what is right, live how is right, and I fall short 100 times a day, and 100 times more worry that my life has become, as it were, a mere museum of my past life, built on equivocation and compromise, to which all I do is add new artifacts and trinkets. I may be extrapolating wildly here, but I think that what was happening in that laugh at me moment at the Lyric Theatre was that members of the audience were connecting or reconnecting with an inner seam of dissent present in us all. Belfast has changed exponentially in the last 38 years, but the character represented on the stage, like the man on whom he is based, stands at the same critical angle to his world, this city, in 2018, exactly as he did in 1980. he is still calling out the shortcomings. And of all those who would ridicule or belittle or otherwise try to marginalize him, he says the same thing now as then: fucking let them. It is, as I say, a defiantly dissenting voice. And even though it could have got you sent off in the 1970s, could get you sent off still, and is certainly not one which Mary Ann McCracken would have approved of, it is to me a profoundly decent voice. As decent, in fact, as up your hole. Which, even so, something tells me, might not be quite the words to go out on. So, there being no actual torch to hand on to Brighton, my last act before quitting this bendy bus of an address is to the team there, this message for next year. Bend it. Stretch it. Double it. Peace.